Isaiah 53, one of the most famous and highly debated passages in the Old Testament. I believe the Lord showed me a framework onto how to better understand it that'll help push the conversation forward. Because I'm very zealous to say it was fulfilled in one, Yeshua of Nazareth. But let's actually have a dialogue about it as to why I believe that. So first thing, one of the most helpful things we could do is to study prophecies, is to see how the New Testament actually used prophecy. Because it's a lot more nuanced than just this is what the Messiah was supposed to do. Jesus did it, although I do believe that is there firmly in some cases, and that sort of overlaps to what I'm going to say. Check out my Messiah 2024 playlist in terms of just looking at literal things spoken that happened in the world because of Jesus. As far as the New Testament and the apostles and the evangelists are concerned, a lot of time it's a lot more nuanced, and scholars like Dr. Michael Heiser have gotten into this, where a lot of times, or even inspiring philosophy, the way they use prophecy is toward us to suggest things that Jesus did that parallel the story of Israel. They see a parallel in that, and then they quote the Old Testament to sort of show that. So it's more about typological fulfillment and sort of a motif that's being fulfilled than necessarily a direct literal type of thing. And part of the reason we know that is because some of the prophecies that are quoted in the New Testament are not messianic. Now, you would think if you're going to make a story or a narrative about something to the hopes and expectations of all the Messiah is supposed to do, you would just quote those prophecies and potentially fabricate that Jesus did it. But if you're quoting things that weren't interpreted to be messianic at all, what it suggests is that you as a community actually have these traditions, legitimate traditions, and you're looking back in the Old Testament to find any parallel or any typological thing, such as with the virgin birth, such as with Jesus being called out of Egypt. This suggests the legitimacy of these traditions that the earliest community generally had about Jesus and his upbringing and stuff like that, because they're looking to the Old Testament for proof, things that nobody would have understood as messianic about the Messiah. So it's a typological type of thing, the way the New Testament uses prophecy. The uses of motifs that they see Jesus fulfilling Israel's story. And here's why I want to say that, is because I have the tetragrammaton on my hat as well, in Paleo-Hebrew. Part of the reason I want to say that is because when you go from that perspective of a motif, right, how the New Testament uses motifs, right, because we have Jesus, who was an Israelite, who perfectly kept the law, who taught from the law, who we know his followers generally believed he resurrected in Jerusalem, based on looking at some of the early creeds we can find in the New Testament. What's the most fascinating thing about that is we can see that the New Testament believers generally believe that Jesus rose from the dead before they ever started using the Old Testament as an apologetic. You know what I'm saying? Let me say that one more time. The believers of Jesus believed he actually resurrected from the dead before they ever went back to use the Old Testament as an apologetic to non-believers. And part of this goes how the majority of scholars, based on the creeds and other information, show that the earliest Christian movement legitimately believed that Jesus had resurrected. The question is how to interpret that, but the majority of scholars will give you that they generally believe Jesus had resurrected from the dead. And that was paramount to them later using the Old Testament and generally believing these things have happened. So let me bring it back to Isaiah 53, because when we have this idea of a motif, how the New Testament uses prophecy as a sort of motif to what Jesus did, how much more fascinating does it get when we look at Isaiah 53 as a motif, and when we begin to read it, see all the amazing parallels based on the literal details of the verses that actually directly match with Jesus' life and the effect he would have, such as Gentile kings coming to believe in the God of Israel on account of him, which we can see especially in the 3rd and 4th century after he was arrived. So little things like that, when we go from the perspective of a motif, that perfectly reconciles whatever immediate context Isaiah was talking about, right? So we could get into some other stuff too about prophecy, or if this is about the Messiah or about Israel and all the things pertaining to the grammar and the language. And since the Hebrew Bible has prophecies fulfilled hundreds of years after the fact outside of messianic stuff, when we know that the Bible predicts a real Messiah and we have a precedent for it stuff being fulfilled hundreds of years later, then within those two cross sections we can't disclude someone claiming to be the Messiah based on this passage without actually going to the passage and proving or disproving it, right? So people who just say Jesus didn't fulfill this because Isaiah was in a specific context and he was thinking of Jesus, it's just lazy work. That comes with a presupposition of naturalism, because to disprove Jesus fulfilled it, you actually have to go to the text and disprove that Jesus fulfilled it. Because the Bible predicts a real Messiah, and we have a precedent for things being fulfilled hundreds of years after the time of a prophet. So we can't use Jesus being in a different time or later time as a disqualification when he claimed to be the one fulfilling the scriptures. When we go from the paradigm of it being a motif, them using it a motif, the original context of Isaiah, whatever it may be, is totally reconciled anyway, because they're using these things as a motif of things they genuinely believe in, going back to the Old Testament from that perspective. So imagine how fascinating it is where the same way people read Isaiah 53 now, the first one they think of as Jesus, is that the earliest Christians generally believe he rose before they ever went to Isaiah 53 in the first place as well. And imagine how fascinating it becomes when you look at it as a motif and see literal things spoken in said motif fulfilled in Jesus' ministry and his global effect. The direct link becomes clear and cool and visible, even just looking just from a neutral, non-presuppositional perspective of what was spoken in the Hebrew Bible, looking at world history, either from a general perspective or even how the New Testament uses prophecy as a motif, and sort of looking at the scriptures from a prophecies from a motif perspective and finding literal details actually fulfilled beyond that you wouldn't expect. So just some 2 cents. I'm saying, y'all be blessed in the Messiah. Catch you in the next one.